Hello and welcome to Real Crusades History, where we use primary sources to get at the truth about the Crusades. Now, there are some really, truly bad videos on YouTube about the Crusades. The Discovery Channel's documentary, I believe it's called The Truth About the Crusades or something like that. It's just absolute unhistorical nonsense. The Monty Python documentary is nonsense, and of course, the movie Kingdom of Heaven is just absolute ahistorical rubbish. Jonathan Riley Smith, who is the leading Crusades historian, mentioned this. There's this idea propagated by a lot of this nonsense that the Crusades were some kind of greedy, violent assault against a peaceful Islamic civilization, which is, of course, ridiculous. All of the lands that the Crusaders were trying to take from Muslim leaders were originally Christian lands that had been conquered by the Islamic world over the course of the 4 centuries that preceded the First Crusade. And during that time, the Islamic powers committed unbelievable atrocities against Eastern Christians. And essentially, the Crusades were an attempt to both avenge those atrocities and prevent the Muslim powers from continuing those atrocities. So today we're going to look at some primary sources that come from the medieval Middle East, written by medieval Middle Easterners, which demonstrate some of this stuff. Michael the Syrian was an important medieval Middle Eastern chronicler, and he wrote about some of the Arabic conquests of Eastern Christian lands. He wrote, "The Arabs grew rich, increased, and overran the lands which they took from the Romans," and of course he's referring to the Byzantine Christians, "and which were given over to pillage." He also wrote about after the Muslim conquest of the Christian city of Damascus, Umar sent Khalid with an army to Aleppo and the Antioch region. There they murdered a large number of people. No one escaped them. Whatever may be said of the evils that Syria suffered, they cannot be recounted because of their great number, for the Arabs were the great rod of God's wrath. So what he's discussing there is the fact that the Arabs, over the course of the 9th and 10th centuries, were pillaging and destroying Christian lands in the East, and this is exactly what provoked the Crusades. And even more so, in the 11th century, the Muslim Turks began conquering the Syrian region and committed unbelievable atrocities against Eastern Christians in exactly the areas of the world where the Crusades took place. As a response to that, Vardape Aristakes was an 11th century Armenian Christian historian, and he wrote about some of his observations of what the Turks were doing to his people. Here's a passage from his history. He writes, "When the enemy attacked, they cut the citizens down, not after the fashion of a war, but as though they were slaughtering sheep penned up in a yard. Swords in hand, the Muslims came upon some, fell upon them like beasts, pierced their hearts, and killed them instantly. As for the stout and corpulent, they were made to go down on their knees, and their hands were secured down by stakes. Then the skin, together with the nails, was pulled up on both sides over the forearm and shoulder, as far as the tips of the second hand, forcibly removed, and the Turks fashioned bowstrings out of them. Oh, how bitter this narration is." Yeah, that's an understatement, I would say. That's a brutal massacre. And then he goes on to talk about the massacre of Christians by Muslims in another city. This is a city called Ani, which was an important medieval Armenian city. And this occurred in the 1050s, which is just a couple decades before the First Crusade. So Aristakes writes, "One could see there the grief and calamity of every age of humankind, for children were ravished from the embraces of their mothers and mercilessly hurled against rocks, while the mothers drenched them with tears and blood. Father and son were slain by the same sword. The elderly, the young, priests and deacons also died by the same sword. The city became filled from one end to the other with bodies of the slain, and the bodies of the slain became a road. From the countless multitude of the slain, and from the corpses, that great stream which passed by the city became dyed with blood. wild and domesticated beasts became the cemeteries of those corpses, for there was no one to cover over the bodies of the slain with the needed earth, no one to bury them. The lofty and beautiful palace was burned, while all other structures were transformed into mounds of earth. So, the point here is that prior to the First Crusade, Muslims were slaughtering Eastern Christians in lands that had been Christian lands, which had been taken by Islamic conquerors over the course of 4 centuries prior to the First Crusade. And so to portray the Crusades as some kind of barbaric act of violence against a peaceful people is just ridiculous. Obviously, the Turks weren't peaceful. They were extremely warlike, and they had been conquering Christians for a long time when they had to face the Crusaders. And in addition, there's every indication to believe that the Turks and Muslim forces planned on trying to conquer all of Western Europe, where the Crusaders came from. Saladin wrote, or rather is quoted as saying, "I think that when God grants me victory over the rest of Palestine, I shall divide my territories, make a will stating my wishes, then set sail on this sea for their far-off lands and pursue the Franks there, so as to free the earth of anyone who does not believe in Allah or die in the attempt." So, in other words, Saladin was planning on conquering all of Western Europe and basically wiping out all of Christian civilization together. Saladin certainly wasn't the picture of magnanimity that a lot of these documentaries on YouTube try to present him as. For example, here's an episode in which he was slaughtering some of his military prisoners. This is from Imad ad-Din, who was one of Saladin's scribes. He writes, "He ordered that they should be beheaded, choosing to have them dead rather than in prison. With him was a whole band of scholars and Sufis and a certain number of devout men and ascetics. Each begged to be allowed to kill one of them, and drew his sword and rolled back his sleeve. Saladin, his face joyful, was sitting on the dais. The unbelievers showed black despair." So anyway, I think the point is pretty clear. It's ridiculous to portray the Crusades as some kind of unwarranted attack upon Muslim civilization. Muslim civilization was built upon the slaughter of Christians and the conquest of their lands. And there's every reason, according to the sources, to believe that the Crusades were a response to this. And so we're going to talk some more about that in some later videos.